Hello everyone, today we talk about the first Persian invasion of Greece occurred between 492 and 490 BC, and we will essentially carry out a strategical analysis of the second campaign that occurred in 490 BC, best known as the campaign of Marathon, as takes name the name from the major battle that the Persian and the Hellenic forces opposed, and with the final Hellenic victory that made the Persian invasion aborted. At that point, we know that Darius eventually, before dying, was planning another expedition, but actually it would take 10 years before the Persians set up in motion the largest invasion eventually in 480 BC. So a strategical analysis. Why is this? This is actually the first time I do it on the channel, and I can already tell you it's not really be a full strategical analysis, because strategical analysis are something very complex. They require very thorough study of sources, and also doesn't matter how many hours I can make this video long, it's still, a proper strategical analysis really takes a freaking lot, even for a time so distant in history as this can be, and therefore with all the problems relatively to the shortage of information that we have. But what I mean is that I would like to focus strictly on the strategic dimension of this campaign for an educational and also didactic purpose, because this second campaign during the first Persian invasion of Greece is actually pretty simple in outline. I mean, it's not something very complicated, so it's very good it's a very good example of strategy at the time. You have to think that war, generally speaking, is relatively simple in outlines. I mean, simplicity is a deal that you also have to it's a principle of war. It's something you have to deal with for the sake of the success of the operations. So eventually things get overly complicated, of course, in real war, but let's say that this is the reason why plans and operations and actions try to be simpler, not overly complicated, because attrition factors are already pretty high in every kind of operation, so you want to stick that to the minimum if possible, and so not researching overly sophisticated plans that eventually will most likely be radically changed the more they are complex. As a matter of fact, every plan always changes during the operation itself. So we will also be pretty concise about certain things. Here I prepared for a strategical analysis naturally a set of pictures, also here very simple ones, so of maps actually. So I don't want to confuse your ideas. First of all, we have this beautiful picture of the Achaemenid Empire in green, obviously, if you kind of missed that on the map. And you can see Greece on the far left, in the west, this pretty tiny thing in yellow. And naturally this is an approximation that, however, it gives you the dimension of how important. This is a bit like David versus Goliath, isn't it? I mean, this is actually something that happens pretty often in military history, that there is a guy that is enormously stronger, apparently, than the tiny one, and it eventually gets defeated, sometimes in spite also of its strength. And this is actually more evident in the second Persian invasion of Greece, as actually the Achaemenid force that invaded Greece in the first time wasn't actually a big thing. I didn't tell before that in 492 BC the Persians had essentially passed from the north. They had managed to subdue most of they had made reinforced the client status of Macedon. They had extended influence. At this time Darius had the Achaemenid king of kings had also launched certain operations into the Black Sea, into the Danubian area, into the Scythian area. So at this time the Achaemenid Empire was fresh, was young, was aggressive, was expanding pretty fast. it was this young force that indeed managed to build one of the greatest empires in the history of human civilization. It was, however, a bit unstable in part at this point, because especially quick expansions naturally require also a physiological time of settling in some part. Darius at this time, actually, if I'm not wrong, had usurped the throne of Persia, so he wasn't really. He had a lot of trouble also in fight within the same empire. And the conflict, one of them between against the Greeks is something that also has very complicated roots. When you think about the so-called Persian Wars, by the way, it's a very Hellenocentric name. I didn't talk about the Persian Wars up to now extensively. I made a couple of videos about here and there about the Greeks versus Persians, but we kind of never got pretty thoroughly into it in the channel, so today also we'll probably skip most of that, but just a word being spent on the background of this campaign. It's important to remember that the strict opposition between Greeks and Persians at this time was not clear. I mean, there definitely was, as a tendency, as every people tends to fight for its own freedom and possibly also the, the subjugation of others. So also in here it's pretty transversal. There was no good or bad guy. Yeah, of course, the Persians were invading the Greek lands, so naturally we tend to sympathize, etc. But if you look at the context, you realize that first of all there was plenty of Greeks that already lived into the Persian Empire in itself. Also Herodotus, that we're discussing it now, was essentially born and living in the say in the Achaemenid Empire, as many other Greeks of the Anatolian coast that, by the way, had seen some of the actually first and major developments, especially because actually of being also into the Persian Empire. Think about Miletus and history of philosophy, how important this crossroads between thoughts, civilizations, etc., that eventually sparked this kind of genius of the Greeks that so much importance and kind of genetic importance had in the building of what we call the Western civilization. But also in here the the intersections between the Achaemenids and Europe are important. The Medes were Indo-European. They were coming from the steppes, just like the Hellenes had come from the steppes, like the Celts, the Germans, the Italics, etc. So it's yeah, we have wanted often to stress this bit of this stereotype and prejudice of the Persians, the terrible Eastern hordes, and the Greeks, the pure heroes. It was actually a very dirty business from both sides. There were lots of Greeks at this point. This is also important to understand, especially the first Persian invasion of Greece. But also naturally the second, that many Greeks were actually good under the Persians. And some of them enjoyed certain decentralized control from the Persians. They this time was actually a very important moment, however, in the rise of the democracies. So the Greek city-states were naturally already they were expanding pretty much. They were a pretty effervescent force at this point. They were experimenting lots of new political ideas and institutions, etc. So the first Persian invasion of Greece is also and the Greek victory at Marathon is regarded as the beginning of the golden age of Greece, in this sense. So you have to keep that in mind. So the idea, I don't know where I was going to this, but yeah, let's say that there were different factions, different parties within the same Greek city-states. So also in here, quite approximately saying that the tyrant, kind of a monarchical direction, and the democratic one. Also in here, it was, as a matter of fact, always a sort of matter of oligarchies. It's not democracies as we intend them today. Now, or something quite, but let's say that at a certain point the democratic revolts kind of sparked in part the same intervention of the Persians into the Greek affairs. The very first rebellion, one of Miletus, that had occurred into Asia Minor at this point, you have to think that there was a previously to the Persians, it was a Lydian empire into which these Greeks had on the Ionian coast had already dwelled, and eventually the Persians come in, and okay, at the first point they agree. The Greeks fight alongside the Persians, and so it's a bit of this story, but Miletus at a certain point rebels, and it rebels against the Persians proper, because the local tyrant actually was punished by the Persian local satrap, and that had been formerly an ally of his, and he does something that is not really understood today, but essentially he makes Miletus rebelling, renouncing to the tyrantship, and making it a democracy, and this sparks a sort of chain of domino effect relatively to the local revolt, because this democratic regime is backed by cities like Athens and Eretria that even sent an army into Asia Minor, and they managed to destroy Sardis, that was one of the capitals of the Achaemenid Empire, so in open opposition against the Achaemenids. And they triggered obviously the fury of the Persians, that what the hell are you doing? And this democratic regimes obviously were mostly interested in trade and being autonomous, so it's a kind of a thing that occurs pretty often in history, that there is and that it's difficult to understand because we kind of embellished a little bit with terms like democracy and freedom, but if you really look at all these kind of wars of throughout all history, so forgive me the approximation, but this kind of independence wars, you realize that most of those were actually all about money. I mean, the local guys were not really interested in giving real freedom or real democracy. At least there was still some kind of oligarchy that managed, and you can see that extensively in history in every kind of what they wanted was essentially not to pay taxes to or at least not to be stemmed in other ways in their autonomous economical political business by other peoples, which is legitimately fine, but it's also something much more material than that, also because the Greeks, once they reach a certain autonomy, they become to create their own empires, so subjecting even other Greeks and taking away freedom and money from them as well. So this is kind of the standard of history in actual fact. So besides this parenthesis that I don't know how necessary it was, so because when I talk about military history, I should be concise, because things like strategical analysis have to be clear, neatly shaded. So I already told too much and also poorly. So but I feel the need to give, however, a bit of background as well, because this can make it more interesting. So passing to this analysis. So first of all, looking at the initially there is also a lot of diplomatic action. So the Achaemenid want to repress the Greeks that had participated to the Ionian revolt, and to incorporate, in a certain sense, all the southern Balkans into the Achaemenid sphere of influence. And in order to do that, they naturally had to curb the hubs of the hotbeds of these democratic regimes that had been so openly against them. At this point, the Persians sent also ambassadors to the main cities like Athens or Sparta, and their diplomats get killed. Their ambassadors get killed. So it's a pretty open declaration of enmity. And the Achaemenid Empire was a universal empire, so it was very important. Also, let's leave aside the strictly ideological thing now, but it's important that such rebellions, such offenses do not go unpunished, because it's a matter of deterrence. As long as you can keep everybody scared of you, you have a certain power of these people. If these people see that they can do what they want and not getting stopped, they will keep doing it. And this is in a nutshell how international politics is all about. So here you see that there were certain Greeks that were essentially siding with the Persians. Why were they doing that? Because they were scared. Yeah. So that's which is also perfectly fine. They had not all to lose from an Achaemenid domination. We've seen it. You can argue that, yeah, I mean, the Persian wars could have definitely radically changed it and stabbed the development of the Hellenic classical civilization as we know it, but it was still a relatively decentralized area of the empire, so we can argue that in part, and this explains why so many Greeks were siding with the Persians as well, because they also had interests. And this is also the case of cities like Athens. In fact, the the Athenian tyrant Hippias, that had been exiled from Athens during when his family was basically thrown out. The Pisistrades were thrown out of Athens. You have to think that the Athenian democracy at this point is very young. It's like 50 years, and for about 35 years, the Pisistrad dynasty, say, has ruled in there. So the Athenians have exiled these guys, and Hippias has actually lived at Darius' court for many years, and he hoping that he could help him regain control into Athens. So there were Greeks, and these Greeks had, by the way, the Achaemenid Empire also could afford, Greek mercenaries, and some of those came from these same exiles and people and other cities of Greece of the Greek cities that also were into the Persian Empire, especially in the Ionian coast. So many interests involved, as you can clearly understand. So the Persian invasion of Greece at this point, we've seen the first one. It basically was aborted by a tempest that shattered the Persian fleet at Mount Athos, but had achieved substantial results into the north with Macedonia. We've already said that, and obtaining actually standing the Persian domination also on other areas, like this expedition had been led by Mardonius, who was the son-in-law of Darius, if I'm not wrong. He had managed to crush the Ionian revolt and to extend its power also in Propontis, so from there had gone into Thrace and into Macedonia, and he would have arrived to Greece if this tempest had not made the campaign aborting. But the invasion, let's say, even if it started 2 years after this, so not the ensuing season, but the following one, it was still part of the same invasion of the first invasion. That at least we framed this, these two campaigns into this historiographically in this way. So what is interesting about the first Persian invasion of Greece is that the Persians kind of got it right. They had they had kind of well projected and also led their own campaign. The commanders were up to the task. And if you look at the first Persian war, you say that, oh well, the Greeks won it. Well, not really. Because really most of the Persian objectives of the first Persian war were achieved. It was just the Battle of Marathon that actually was in this sense, a minor setback. But overall, the Persians, with the first invasion, kind of got most of Greece and the Cyclades and all these cities in the Ionian coast under their domain. So under their dominion. It was just Athens and Sparta that were still kind of hanging on their own. even Eretria, that had been siding with Athens during the Ionian revolt, was taken during the first Persian expedition. Also in here, Eretria had, just like Athens, economical interests. By the way, this Eretria participated to kind of back the Ionian, I think Miletus itself, for certain war aids that had received. Athens was kind of more even emotionally attached to the Ionian coasts, because traditionally those were believed to have been to Ionian cities, sorry, because traditionally those were believed to have been Athenian colonies. So imagine also how this world could be in relation, how the Greeks were still. But anyhow, it wasn't that ruinous. It wasn't a defeat in the first place. It was kind of a draw at a broader strategical level. So if you, in this perspective, the only minor fault was the defeat of Marathon. That, however, was to have, in this sense, not even a huge strategical influence, but definitely gave the Greeks a great confidence that that allowed them to fight on during the second Persian War. Sorry, that was essentially the one in which they kind of more seriously could bring to the final. Also a much greater involvement both from the Persian side and the Greek side. So, but we'll talk about that in another moment. So, as we were saying, so if you even look at it from the Persian point of view, it's not that they were that bad, because actually these Hellenic cities were pretty dynamic, pretty turbulent in their, they were developing these very dynamic and active democratic policies that under this name actually concealed a sort of also an aggressive mindset, and you have seen that how the Athenians and the Eretrians had participated actively destroying one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. So it's not something you can go without saying, oh well, yeah. And it was actually a form of, I mean, if this revolt had not happened, probably the same Persian wars might have not existed, or at least they would have happened in very different moments, because actually also the strategical needs of these very big empires like the Achaemenid ones were pretty serious things, and the Persians were involved at multiple times and basically on all the frontiers of the empire, also into civil wars, as we have interseen conflicts, etc. So it's not that you launch an expedition with so many resources committed to it for no reason. So it's really, there was an active Hellenic behavior that sparked the Persian reaction. And as we were saying before, this was not just about, two paritary powers. The Achaemenid Empire was the universal empire, into which also partly the Greeks thought themselves to be in spite of their love for autonomy and etc. So you have to think about it in strategical terms as well, in terms of moral resources, because you don't go to war with the biggest power that exists at the time for no reason. You really have to have confidence in yourself. You have to believe you can achieve something good from it. And these were small city-states. Yeah, the Greeks were developing a sort of universe on their own within these city walls. They had that, as we were saying, eventually developed, were managed to export also in the rest of the world, making our own world, in part setting the essentials in most cases what we still reason like. This is very important, especially if you have studied history of philosophy, the history of thought, you realize that the Greeks were the first ones to do certain things. Herodotus, our source for this whole analysis, is essentially the first historian, as we know it. He's the first chronicler that didn't just take into account, you know, a bunch of stories that were told, you know, were mixed with legend and myth, etc. No, he wanted to actually explain how things had gone, also in a pretty recent past, and starting to tell these stories in a way that could be verifiable. Yes, of course, Herodotus has been criticized because also lots of what he wrote was relatively debatable. This started straight away with Thucydides, that also, by the way, basically continued his work, at least chronologically speaking. He started writing his stories in from when Herodotus has stopped, so actually giving him credit for things he had written before. But I mean, it was a new way of looking at the world. It was in strict philosophy, in theoretical terms, the beginning of categories. The ancient world didn't know scientific categories as we do it today. The Greeks were the first one to theorize them and to kind of partly detaching them from the actual reality. I mean, the Greeks at this point were not secular, but were starting to think in terms that could factually check what the reality was about. So that while for an Achaemenid, I don't know, a tree was not a tree as like others, but it was that tree that maybe had, I don't know, magic powers. It was located in that point. It had also a story in its own. The Greeks start to think like, can I define what a tree is? This is something very important because it implies a certain view of the world that starts being much more objective and kind of also applicative. I don't know how to say that. But this is important, and when you study the Persian Wars, you have to bear this in mind, because it's not a simple clash between certain peoples that had that were, I don't know, homogeneous in the way they were actually two different civilizations here. We also, this time, we don't have to excessively stress that, because there were many points of intersection. It was a still pretty hybrid nature of this. The Greeks kept dwelling into the Persian Empire for forever, practically, but still they were different. Think about Xenophon. Think about, I mean, these figures that actually were made a living out of serving the Persians, or at least of having a direct interaction and knowing their customs and even and understanding them, but still remaining a bit. In fact, what you can say is did the Persians underestimate the Greeks? Possibly. This is also a bit of an ideological question, in my opinion, but yeah, there is a big deal, especially if you think that you are the king of kings, the one that has to rule over, that has a sort of divine mandate that is there. And you look at these, the Greeks thought that the Medes, the Persians, were barbarian, and you have to think naturally the Persians thought the same of the Greeks. I mean, who were the Greeks? There were these guys dwelling there in the frontier of the empire, of a huge empire. So, what is that objectively? How could the Greeks stop the mighty king of kings? That was the main, and the Achaemenids had dealt with much more powerful enemies than the Greeks at this time. Because this is also something we will have to cover, because there is this idea that the Greeks were more trained, more capable. Absolutely not. Actually, the Achaemenid military was way more advanced than the classical Hellenic one. Don't talk to me about Alexander the Greek, please. There we are in the Hellenistic period. It has wholly another thing, also from perspective of warfare. here we're talking about a bunch of citizens, of guys who basically refused with the usual exception of Sparta, by the way. They refused, in the first place, the idea of military professionalism. So the idea is that also the politic phalanx is born exactly not to be a trained force, but to be the less a compromise between the least possible training, because these were guys who had a wholly different living. And they despised war as a professional life, a professional activity, and they thought it was a barbaric thing in this sense, because it was the barbarians who fought all the time in their tribes and all. They were citizens. They lived in cities. They had business. They had crafts. They didn't have time for war. So also here, I promise I will make a lesson also on the Hoplitic phalanx that people always can seem like to get wrong all the time, to explain why the Greeks won over the Persians. I don't know why still in 2019, where it's plenty of books of historiography, we still need to have to think this in pop culture, but anyhow. Also, by the way, today we'll start essentially dealing with the campaign proper. Before this, I would like to stress that this is not a video about the Battle of Marathon. I will make a video about the Battle of Marathon one day. This is not about the Battle of Marathon. I will talk about the battle just as for the strategical consequences that it had, because obviously also what happened in the battle had strategical consequences, but I will not make a tactical history of the Battle of Marathon. This is a strategical history of the second campaign of the first Persian invasion of Greece. Okay. So passing finally to the campaign. Excuse me, I put the number here so I know when I have to insert the picture. What were, first of all, the strategic goals of the Persians? Because that's something you have to understand. You can't study wars by just saying, oh, this wanted to repress Greece, and no, you have to understand that all military operations, especially at the level like the one that could be of the Achaemenid Empire, was something that was accurately planned and really thought of. Okay, so we have to essentially enucleate what these objectives were. And these were very few. They were very precise. So this is useful in planning, because you exactly know, you have clear points you have to stick to. You can't doubt, you can't say, well, maybe there was not a priority given to each one of them. I mean, it was like a more complex thing, but also about this we don't really know very much. Surely, probably they knew, in my opinion, that there was a priority, but this is just me speculating. By the way, a lot of this campaign is about informations that are, as we were saying before, very, very scanny. So why do we talk about this? I'm not really reinterpret the strategic development of the campaign, because the Persian wars is something that are studied since these very times up to today, and oceans of inks have been written about this. There are very few data. Everything is being studied, so you can't really, unless you don't find, I don't know, an outstanding archaeological evidence that reveals you something new about that area at the time. I mean, that's the history we're gonna get, so you can't really go straight. There are still people who say very silly things, in my opinion, about this, and it's just speculation. But if you stick to the sources and you actually tell the story, yeah, you can speculate about certain aspects that we do not know, but more or less the story is this one. There are people who have even doubted that Herodotus was writing a factual truth, that he invented the whole thing, but I don't think so. As a matter of fact, I believe he also, what he writes, if you want to also think about the reliability of a source, naturally you have to cross it with other sources, and Herodotus has not really ever been disproved by evidence. On the contrary, especially archaeological evidence has been pretty supportive of the version that Herodotus gives about the campaign. But sometimes, and this is especially an advice for military historians if you are interested in such things, is that never dismiss a source for, for what kind of source it is. Always listen to what it has to say, because if there is a logic in it, you can say, well, okay, yeah, this might be still made up, but it's still plausible. And this is important because, if anything, maybe if you can prove that this existed, you can still make your mind work around it, and it's still the, like in this case, the few, if not only, historical evidence we have. So why doubting of it? Sometimes historians tend to overcomplicate these interpretations. I don't know why. And actually, military history teaches you a little bit to be a bit more, to stay on track, because also logic has to be simple, just like war. And I say this because I myself tend to overcomplicate things, while actually they're simpler than they do. But in military history, tend even to simplify them. I mean, not to make it looking at the essential and not at detail. That can be interesting and very revealing, but it has also to be framed correctly into kind of a hierarchy of, of importance given the chance and other things. So strategical analysis are difficult because, differently from the tactical ones, they have to take into account a huge amount of informations compared to the history of a battle. This is self-evident, but if you want, also von Clausewitz said the same thing. The history of battle is much simpler because you have much less data on average. The strategical picture is way more complicated. So, looking at the Persian objectives against the Greeks, what were they? So, first of all, the first one was naturally reassess Achaemenid power on the Greeks of the of Ionia, so that were subjects of the Achaemenid Empire, and that whose rebellion had just been kind of sedated by, actually during the first campaign with Mardonius. This was important because you have to understand that that area was particularly wealthy. And it would remain, historically speaking, like the west of Asia Minor, because of this very intense Greek presence, has always been a very wealthy area, very dynamic in trade, especially very populated, urbanized. It was important for the Persians to keep it under their dominion. Now, these guys had been repressed. What is kind of ironic is that part of the rebellion had brought actually to the change also of other regimes, because Mardonius had kind of repressed a bit the whole area, and since certain cities were de facto remained to tyranny, it's paradoxical that the Achaemenids kind of overthrew this regime, regimes, and actually installed democracies in there. So also in here, don't think that the Achaemenids were actually pro-tyrants for the local Hellenic local citizen governments, and that they loathed democracy in the first place. It was not about that. It was really about certain cities wanting to get freer and to start also interfering into for their own interests, especially into this Ionian area. That was pretty important also for the same Greeks of the Balkans, naturally, as they were the major trade partners, and they shared all their Hellenic identity, culture, and they had strong ties with them. So this was the show-off, like showing these guys from there that had just rebelled, that not only now they had been repressed and therefore, but also showing what the empire could do against the other Greeks who had supported them, so chiefly the Athenians and the Eretrians. And by showing this, making the whole Greek world understand that they didn't have to mess up with the empire. Very, very important, because this was probably really the most important objective, because as we were saying before, and also Herodotus actually states this, is that before even the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks were terrified by the Persians. The only name of them that they feared, and they were scared. By the way, yeah, the Athenians and the Eretrians had gone with this army into Asia Minor, and the local satrap actually didn't engage them into battle, but they kept harassing them with the cavalry that the Greeks really didn't have, at least in large, consistent numbers, and they had suffered lots of losses. So the Achaemenid Empire, the Achaemenid military at this time was the most advanced in there, and the Greeks knew that meeting them especially in open battle was kind of a pretty risky business. And now what the Persians were doing was to mount up a willing expedition for setting foot in the same Greek motherland, so like pushing for that confrontation. The second objective of the Persians was to punish chiefly the leaders of the let's say democratic party, that were the Athenians and the Eretrians, that were these major communities of the Greek motherland that, as we've seen, were involved directly into the rebellion. That more in general, were still pushing for also they were a standing example for the other Greeks. This is also important. The other Greeks had remained more or less faithful to the empire, but they obviously they wished they could kind of escape the Persian rule and be more to be freer. So a big deal of how usually the Persians punished the rebels was deportation. It was about deportation, and this was pretty important, because it was not simply a punishment. It was actually something functional for the same demographic dynamics of the empires at those times. The Persian Empire was very large. There were past conflicts had brought to the population of certain areas, so it was normal when crushing an enemy to basically deportate great part of the population into these inhabited lands of the empire. This had many advantages, because these lands could be put at new use through chiefly agriculture, naturally, and plus basically eradicating these rebellious communities from their original from their native land. So like settling them from the other side of the empire and letting them, making it impossible to actually still continue operating at that distance. It was not really putting themselves in a condition they could still do harm from that position, because naturally at that point the Achaemenids controlled their settlement. They disarmed them. They could check them better. I mean, if you take the Greeks now, you see that their main form of organization was the city. This was important. And the city is something that has a strategical weight, because it's surrounded by walls. It can store lots of resources, so it's kind of more dangerous than and actually the whole Achaemenid Empire was already had several Greek communities, actually also not in the properly Greek areas, like in the coasts of Ionia, where the Greeks had dwelt basically on their own. There were communities scattered also somewhere else. It was important, for instance, at the time of Alexander the Great, that when he conquered the Achaemenid Empire, he found Greeks into Bactria. It would be roughly today's Afghanistan, and these were Cretans, if I'm not wrong. They came from Crete, and they had settled, and it was also a viable option for the for certain communities. Think about the Greeks at this time expanding also with their apoikia, their colonies, their demic colonies, by the way. So the Greeks at this point had the problem of their motherland not being able to sustain enough population, and they simply sent these populations, these groups of people, to found other colonies around the Mediterranean. So some of these communities sometimes said, okay, wait, don't we go into the Achaemenid Empire? I mean, I've heard there is land out there. It could be profitable to live in there, and especially if it was a decentralized position, that was kind of good, because from one end they both won from both sides, because the Achaemenids needed that for economy, these guys needed them for making a living, and they kind of the Achaemenid rule was relatively light. It wasn't anything extremely oppressive, so it was fine. Was a viable option. I mean, and that's why also, as we were saying before, many Greeks actually cooperated with the Persians, because they were fine, and there was a lot of cooperation. So also the Persian wars can't be interpreted Greeks versus Persians at all. There were much more complex reasons. For the same, as we have said before already, for the same actual existence of these wars. I mean, if history had gone in another way, maybe this Ionian revolt would have not occurred, the Athenians or the Eretrians would have not intervened. Lots of different options that could be open at this point. Even if you look at broader, say, development of the Hellenic civilization, you realize that more or less sooner or later the Achaemenids would have tried to kind of incorporate it more directly, but however, this is not the point. The third point, the third strategic objective of the Persians was to back in fact the already existing pro-Persian factions into the Hellenic cities. I mean, even in the independent ones, so not the ones of Ionia, but also the ones of Greece proper, by showing off the Persian power, and therefore letting these same pro-Persian parties into the Hellenic cities to make most of the work, politically speaking, inside of the communities. So this was all. These are kind of three elementary points, and they're pretty obvious. So that's why I was saying that actually the same campaign is pretty simple also, because it had very clear objectives. And so the expedition was mounted up by Darius by entrusting it to to Artaphernes, who was his nephew. Artaphernes was son of the satrapas of Lydia, who was also called Artaphernes, who was Darius' brother, by the way. And the other commander was Datis, who was a Median. So this basically the same Achaemenids were Medians in origin, and they so it was a kind of a combined. It had two leaders. It's fine. This is also the unity of command is something you have to look at. You know, this was a big expedition, a fairly big expedition. There had to be some kind of also political check of this. So we basically don't have a clue about how many I mean, we have a clue obviously, but we don't know explicitly by any source, from any source, how many the Persians were, or better, we actually know. We actually have sources that tell us how many they were, but they are much later sources, and they tell pretty exaggerated numbers that have nothing to do with factual, with reality. They all wanted to stress how many Persians were, and the most reliable datum we can essentially build upon how speculating how many the Persians were are the 600 triremes that Herodotus said to have been set up by the Persians to launch the invasion. So basically there is a big deal in historiography of speculation of how many troops these 600 triremes could really bring with them. I think the Persian army was personally 15,000 troops. Usually numbers are a bit greater. Usually they range from like 18,000 to 28,000. To me they were roughly that one. Maybe there were 16,000 counting cavalry as well, but we are in that range. So how counting this thing? Well, making a quick we can say that a trireme at that time could have load a maximum of 200 men. So this would make a maximum total of 120,000 men. But actually most of these men were not the soldiers of the Achaemenid army. They're actually the sailors, the crewmen. So we can assume a trireme could bring something like 30, 40 infantrymen. So this would make the number arrive to 18,000 and more. But I think there were less for simply some good reasons. First of all, we're talking about not when you think at these numbers in logistics, you don't have to think it how many individuals could physically fit into a ship. You have to reason as if these were military units. So you can't say these were actually it was just about sticking the guys. You have to bring the weaponry, you have to bring the also a comfortable space to stay in. Same goes for horses. There are people who say because in here we don't really know how. We know that there were certain ships that were basically adapted for bringing cavalry in here, and people conjectured that it's possible to bring 30 horses on a trireme. Yeah, okay, but we're talking about a military unit. We're not just talking about 30 horses. We have to think about the gear, the equipment, the provisions, etc. So looking at the broad numbers, you could actually think that first of all, the Herodotus tells us that most of the Persians were infantrymen and also fairly well equipped, and we think, given the numbers, these speculative numbers, that probably the core Persian unit of the invasion was the Bayvarabam. The Bayvarabam was literally, it means how do you say that in English? It means 10,000 men, but I wanted to say it in a better way, and this damn thing here, it means a 10 of thousands. So it's probable that it was just Bayvarabam with actually just a very few other smaller units. The Persian army had a decimal organization. So under the Bayvarabam of 10,000, you had the Azarabam that made up that was 1,000, and 10 Hazarabam made up a Bayvarabam. So probably the Persian army was made up with this one Bayvarabam of 10,000 and some complementary Hazarabams of support. This you have to add also other troops that were coming alongside with the Persians. We know that there were Scythians in the Achaemenid army that also figure into they know that they made up the center into the Persian center into the Battle of Marathon. These were kind of light troops. They were mostly praised as archers. We can assess like yeah, other couple of thousands if you want. Then there were also the Hippias partisans, you have to remember. So these exiled Greeks that were fighting for the for recovering their for being reinstated into their Hellenic motherland by the Persians, and hopefully be brought to power, so reestablishing the tyranny and putting an end to the democratic regimes. We can speculate, these weren't probably a few. There were several Greeks here that were exiles, but most of them were actually Greek mercenaries that the Persians had recruited into Ionia. Probably were like 5,000, I think it's a fair number. These were Ionians and Aeolians mostly. And actually they were not all mercenaries. Probably the mercenaries that the Persians at this time, it was a mistake, that joined the Persian army were during the invasion of the Greek in the Cyclades. That the Persians collected and probably weren't extremely reliable troops. But anyhow, there was also cavalry, as we've said. So what we know, we don't really know what whether the 600 triremes were just for the men and not for the horses. We have no other evidence. There has been a lot of speculation about this, but you have to take in account. You also have to count other things. First of all, also in here we don't have mention of other transport ships, so we're just counting by this assumptions. And there is another point, that these ships had to carry away to Asia when they would come back the loot. So some of them had necessarily to be empty. You don't launch a fleet where every single you don't launch an invasion with a fleet in which every single ship is stuffed to make fit everything. You need a lot of other room for other things. So this is very, very important. So given this free other space, and think also about the crews that we said, but also other troops that probably joined from other areas of the empire. The expedition was actually mounted up in Susa, so in the southeast of Mesopotamia, and then eventually passed through different lands of Assyria, Armenia, Cappadocia. I mean, not really necessarily passed through there, but lots of people joined, which was normal in some way. So I give it to 15,000, 16,000, something like that. And all we know, we have also further knowledge about this, is that the Persian army was greater than the Hellenic one at Battle of Marathon. Now the Greeks at Marathon were something like between 10,000 and 9,000, because they corresponded essentially to the potential of the 10 Athenian tribes that had to field normally at 1,900 point. And we know that the Greeks deployed stretching their battle line, so also made it thinner, especially in the center, and they therefore, if the Persians were more, so we are up to this number, and probably I think 15,000 fighters, and lots of other crewmen, and think about the logistics. 600 triremes is a very big number actually for the time. You have to look at mount an expedition like that. It was extremely costly. Think about the supplies and all, etc. So we didn't say how many horses there were. Well, I think the horses, let's assume of these 600 triremes, like 100 were dedicated to the carriage of horses, because a horse is realistically occupying the space of 3 men, and therefore making the equation with what we said before, the carrying it, let's say that every roughly in order to bring 1,000 cavalrymen, it required to bring to dedicate 100 triremes just to that. So Herodotus unfortunately doesn't tell us anything else to be more precise, but these are the normal estimates. So you don't have to naturally think these were big armies. I mean, big armies in history are a problem. Every time you read, especially in this time of the ancient world, armies that surpassed 50,000, I mean, that's already wow. But it's not really about the mass of men. It's really about the fact that it's something impossible to organize orderly. I mean, you can, put even more than that together by ancient standards, but how are you gonna command them? The best option was to have relatively few troops, and already having these 15,000 troops was something impressive at the time. And mounting up an expedition like that across Asia and the Aegean Sea, 600 triremes. I mean, it was pretty big, and it wasn't a big, it's not like the Second Persian War would have been. That was a huge army for those time standards, but nothing like the exaggeration of 1 million fighters that doesn't exist, obviously. But this tells much also about the organizational skills of the Achaemenids, how capable they were to mount up even maritime forces by having conquered Phoenicia and those lands that were pretty versed into to naval business. I mean, the Persians had come from the steppes, so they didn't know much about the sea, but this time that they had fully integrated that in their armored forces. So the Achaemenid army was a hell of an army. In 15,000 it's a right number. It's up to the task. Actually, I like how the Achaemenids organized the thing. I think it was pretty clever, and they did good. So good Achaemenids for now. So as we've said, the first of all, what we can say about this, we hinted at that. We know that cavalry, that the Persian army comprehended cavalry contingent. So, and that for that reason special triremes had been adapted, and that's all we know really. And this is you have to think of the strategical potential of an army like this, because it basically comprehends cavalry. So it's an amphibious force, right? It goes through sea. It can land theoretically everywhere, because it's a mighty force as well. And so it's very mobile, so you can shift this very consistent Achaemenid army wherever you want on the Greek coasts, and plus you have cavalry. So cavalry adds up to the the fleet, and the cavalry up to the strategical unpredictability, let's say, of these of the campaign. Okay, so it was not easy for the Greeks to know what the situation could have been like, because these guys the Persians could really move wherever they wanted with the fleet, and once they landed, they had this dreaded cavalry. But by the way, was made up of some of probably the best cavalries of Asia at that point. The Persians had very good, especially light cavalries, and we have no evidence of heavier cavalry at this point from the steppes, where it was partly present. Surely were armored horsemen as well in the Achaemenid They were just the elite, but were present, in my opinion. And the Greeks especially were chiefly a mounted force. Relatively to this, maybe I will make a video one day, because I suspect that also for other Indo-European, say mostly European, in Europe at this point, peoples, actually the role of cavalry also in the Hellenic warfare has been underestimated for cultural reasons, but at least for this campaign we can't talk about this. Greek hoplites normally could reach the battlefield on horseback, but they would fight on foot. And cavalry was really the symbol of the aristocracies that these democratic regimes were now proudly fighting against. So the idea is that the Greeks had this kind of repulsion towards the idea of mounted combat, because it implied a sort of military professionalism that their citizenry really loathed. And therefore they wanted to, even from the sources, they didn't want to say, okay, that they existed. And in the case of the Greeks, of classical warfare, when I say classical warfare, I'm talking about Hellenic classical warfare. They probably, they had very few cavalry, and there always was, actually. It's not that it was not present, but there were bands just of monarchies of people, and Greek battles were also, Hellenic classical battles were pretty ritualized in part, like the cavalry could pursue only up to a certain point. It's also a bit theoretical, because probably practice was different, and that's what leads me to believe that actually probably the Greek cavalry was not so irrelevant as it's always been said. But anyhow, the greatest evidence we have is this hoplitic phalanxes with infantrymen, okay, thickly packed formations, by the way of heavily armored, especially at this point, hoplites. And this one of the disadvantages of these formations is that being unprofessional and being only infantry, they were naturally extremely vulnerable to flanking cavalry attacks. So the cavalry, in this sense, has to be understood not just from as a tactical option, but also as a strategical options. I mean, it was important for the Achaemenids to mount up an expedition that had a consistent number of cavalry to really neutralize also part of certain advantages that the Greeks could have in open field. And cavalry is very important because it adds up to the strategical also longevity of an army, and dynamism, because it can forage quickly. It can scout, so it's really a big advantage. But we'll talk about this later. What is also interesting, okay, we said about the Scythians, that figure, especially like archers, foot archers mostly, probably was also some probably kind of Scythian cavalry. So looking at the commanders in here, I mean, Artaphernes was the representative. I mean, it was part of the Achaemenid dynasty himself, so he was the nephew of the king, etc. That is this probably was a more skilled individual. He actually he was a Median. And what is very interesting about him is that what Herodotus writes about Datis. Datis was an admiral, firstly, and he was actually an expert in Greek affairs. And he had connection with Greek officials, and this was very important, as we will see now with Hippias, that was this prominent political figure that could restore tyranny into Greece once the Persians would have essentially brought the peninsula under to obedience. And Herodotus estimates really he also participated. I mean, Herodotus. Sorry, Herodotus appreciates him. He actually stresses his religious nature, his piety. He was a now we will see the Persians begin to they send their fleet into the Cyclades, and they kind of begin to storm several cities, and naturally panic spread among the local islanders populations because they fear to be destroyed. And actually Datis wrote I don't remember whether I don't have the text now. Oh yeah, when approaching Delos, actually, Delos at this point was in disarray because the Persian fleet was arriving. So it was, and that is this is what Herodotus tells us, showed clemency to other islands, including this one, in writing to them because the for instance. Let's go by order here. Lindus had been besieged by these were all Greek islands that were invested by the Persian fleet. Lindus had been besieged by the Persians, but unsuccessfully. Naxos were also besieged. Actually, the inhabitants fled to the mountains, and the Persians caught many of them that were enslaved, and they burned down the city and temples of Naxos. Arriving at Delos, Datis sends this letter and says, "Holy man, why have you fled away and so misjudged my intent? It's my own desire and the king's command to me to do no harm to the land where the two gods were born, neither to the land itself nor to its inhabitants. So return now to your homes and dwell on your islands." And Delos was a very important religious center because of the temple of Apollo in there. And Datis landed in there and also burned 300 talents of frankincense on the altar of the deity. So this was a great show of respect that actually kind of impressed even Herodotus that wrote about it. And so this is interesting, is that the same Herodotus was not saying that these guys were barbaric, okay, of the Persians. Herodotus had been grown in the Persian Empire, and this actually caused a lot of very ugly things being written on his account by authors like Plutarch that essentially criticized Herodotus kind of for not being too much pro-Hellenic. But you have really to think about like Plutarch was naturally writing much later, so when the fall of actually even of classicism and Hellenism had developed, and yeah, it was all about the accomplishment of the Greek civilization, etc. But at this time, this was not so obvious. I mean, these enemies evidently respected each other. They also knew each other pretty well, as they lived so close. And Herodotus stresses the how Datis was not a merciless and fierce barbarian, but on the contrary, he was he was a man gifted with a very deep religious sense, and he respected his adversaries. So this is important because you can read it also in a sort of a strategic fashion as well, because here the Persians didn't want to show themselves like the destroyers who wanted to crush the Greeks' point. They just wanted to reestablish peace and order formally, and they were respecters of the local deities, as it was normal to do in polytheism, because in polytheism there was not this thing of my god, of your god. Every god was viable and respecting, especially when you went into a foreign land. Every foreign land has its own local gods, so what you would want it to do at that point was to also propitiate the local deities to your enterprise. So it was important to be respecters. The polytheists had a great sense of respect for different religions, and also in here it was comforting in part. Naturally, we have seen before that the Persians had also destroyed other local temples, but this had to do probably also naturally firstly with political reasons. But there were, let's say, certain deities that were more powerful than others. So the Apollos of Delos was evidently more important for the Greeks, and for these Persians to show respect to the deity equated to make a certain impression on the Greeks, while other minor deities that every other city had, by the way, because this idea of the polytheistic pantheon is kind of an idealistic thing that never existed historically speaking. It was just a literary canonization, but every single Greek city had a different, say, pantheon. There were certain common deities, but every single place kind of had different traditions and all. This is how paganism really was. So this is very, very, very important. So at this point we're gonna briefly look at how the now this picture has remained for long. It basically shows the path that the Achaemenid fleet took. By the way, look at the map of the Aegean Sea, look at the Cyclades, etc. Think at the basically, if you sail in this place, what you see is that there is never a spot of let's say a place where you can't see land. So you can understand this is kind of a land bridge. Even if you think about it also logistically speaking, and stopping in all these various cities and kind of also taking supplies and resting the troops. This was very important also for the triremes, for the oarers that had to stop at a safe harbor. They couldn't be overexhausted, etc. And think about how close the Greek motherland was to Ionia. In here, here it's perfectly clear. You see that all these islands are very, very close. So I think we're gonna skip this part because it's you know, during this phase the Persians have a complete initial success. The Cyclades are crossed without substantial problems, and all those who had opposed the Persians with arms had been substantially wiped out. So at this point the Persians were also recruiting troops in loco and taking hostages, very important as well, because this was a common practice to ensure eventually the fealty of the local city. And they headed towards Euboea. So let me check also in here at which time I have to stop. 1 hour and 18. Okay, and this other map kicks in. So yeah, the expedition goes on, and the Persians land in Euboea, as you can see from here, and what they do is they crush both the city of Charistus and one of Eretria, making a huge quantity of prisoners. this is also in here you realize it's written that the Persians also in here they plunder the area, so this was daily business into warfare, but it had also a strategical effect of deterrence. Okay, so the Persians were trying to always keeping this in mind of what was the best option to do, how to deal with the local population, and excuse me, and with the Eretrians, of course, they were having using iron fist because they were the rebels. Together with the Athenians, they had to be punished for good, let's say, and giving an example to the other Greeks. So at this point, cavalry was very proficuously used at this point, especially during the amphibious operation, because the cavalry was used to secure the landing area perimeter, and this it was extremely very successful as well. So this is also another reason why you wanted to keep cavalry with you as a strategic resource, because it facilitated the landing operations. And by the way, think about the Persians also having bothered themselves to adopt the triremes for carrying horses, etc. So something that they evidently had invested for this very reason, because they knew it would have turned useful. So at this point, everything, I mean, so far so good, right? I mean, think it from the Persian perspective, everything is going rightly how it has to be. Almost all strategic objectives had been reached. The Eretrians had been punished, the Cyclades had been subjugated. Always bear in mind that north of Greece now, Macedonia, etc., were kind of under the Achaemenid rule. So the last one had still, however, to be accomplished, and it was the last attack to Athens. So at this point, Hippias came into play. Hippias, as we were saying, we didn't really talk much about him, but he was the we said it perhaps before. He was the son of the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus, who at this point was counting on the Persian help to come back in power in Athens, and he had been living in the Achaemenid Empire for several years at this point. And however, he had kept relations with Athens, so there were Hippias partisans in Athens were ready they were waiting for the right moment to overthrow the Democratic Party, and Hippias was a very important resource for the Persians, because he was this. You have to think it's also these local dynasties. I mean, were influent, were even the same Greeks that were kind of developing increasingly their democratic systems, and the tyrannies were kind of crumbling in part at this point. But these characters were still very, very influent, and they could at this point come back in power, especially if they had been backed by a strong Achaemenid control over Greece. So it was perfectly feasible. So naturally, also Hippias knew very well the Attic terrain, and he was definitely instrumental for and extremely precious for winning Athens for the Persians. And this is also a very important thing to remember, is that the Persians, even if you look at the troops involved, they were not really a huge invading force. Yeah, they were pretty big, especially for Greek standards, but after all, this had to be a kind of, also, there is a principle of economy in war. You don't overexpand. I mean, not just for what we were saying before, relatively to the difficulty of think of the attrition of fielding a larger army. So you automatically, you know, that the larger the army you use, the more you're gonna, doesn't matter whether, if from a strictly military point of view everything is gonna go fine, you're still losing a substantial amount of resources by sheer attrition. This is a physical principle. It's the second principle of thermodynamics. It's not something you can really complain on it, at least maybe in a parallel universe. But this is the point, is that the Persians didn't really want to, or didn't really need actually, to impose themselves violently on the Greeks. I mean, as we've seen, these local parties could still make it feasible to reinstall pro-Persian tyrannies, and that was it. That was what was left. It was just Athens at this point standing between the Persians and that objective being achieved. So now the whole thing was about Athens properly. So it seemingly Hippias advised to land into the plain of Marathon, on the coastal plain of Marathon. That it's roughly something like 40 kilometers northeast of Athens. So actually, I don't know how you say that in, I say the Latin name, Attica. I think it's Attica in Greek, I'm not sure. Attica was, actually had several landing places. And there were certain reasons for which this happened. Herodotus tells us actually that this plain was very suitable for the usage of cavalry. And this is not really entirely true. I mean, it's 50-50. Another reason, we'll see why. Another reason was that this was the same coastal plain to which Pisistratus, so Hippias' father, had landed in order to conquer the power in Athens several years before, several decades before. So this was a kind of a augural place where to repeat theoretically same action for the Pisistrid family. Telling the truth, so at this point the Persians actually do not land everything into the plain of Marathon. They kind of store part of the fleet in the close island of here I don't find it, of Aegilia, sorry, here it is. You can't see it, it's pretty close. It's like, yeah, like 10 kilometers, okay, something more. So pretty close, and the Persians in here store essentially all they didn't need for combat. So chiefly the prisoners they had captured into the Cycladic islands, and while with the rest of the fighting force they had towards Marathon, and they go in there. So actually partly. So here, I guess we switch to the once again to the map, and we will give a look to the plain of Marathon. I would like to visit it because I think I would get pretty emotional if I saw this plain. For real. I've googled it many times, but I would love to see it myself one day. It was actually also in Greece and also in these places, but they didn't bring us to Marathon actually. So kind of a pity. Anyhow. So what was the point now? We're still sticking to the Persian view. Now we'll go soon also to the Athenian one that enters into play directly at this point. So what you see in here from the map that is kind of a useful is that there is a plain surrounded by a so Herodotus was right about cavalry, because in here you have enough space to enough space. By the way, well, no, that's an anecdote, but maybe that you don't need to know that. However, here you have enough space to maneuver cavalry, and that's important, because that's what already the Persians thought that the Athenians would have kind of, at least they hoped that the Athenians would have baited sending an army to fight in there into an open battle. So here you realize all around this plain there are hills, and on the right, sorry, there is a swamp. Actually, this is a bit more in the northeast. You see here there is the compass tells you north is here a bit switched. However, south it's where the Athenians came from, because you here there was the road that connected it to Athens. Here but looking at the map, let's say on the right, you find these marsh. And there is also a stream here, the Carados, sorry, that you can see here, and we don't know really where it flowed at the time, but here it's usually represented, in fact, yeah, in this fashion, in this direction. So there is a so just imagine to land here with your fleet. Where would you like to set up the camp? First of all, where would you like to land and where to set the camp? Because we don't really know from the sources. So there are several options. The Persian camp might have been placed here on the far right, when you see the Lake Stomy, just like in that hill you see just up over it, dominating the marsh, which would be kind of nice, because there is behind the swamp this kind of lake with non-salty water, by the way, with, I don't know how you say that in English, I don't know. However, it's drinkable water, let's put it in this way. So that's important for a camp. You have to think that military camps have big logistical problems, and they need to have channels to evacuate all the dirt, all the excrements of men, of horses. They have to be cleaned easily. They have to have an accessible amount of water in here, so that would have been a nice place, because, by the way, this also was protected by the swamp in part. But the problem is that if you put the camp in there, basically you can't defend the fleet, because the fleet would have landed in some of these areas. I believe it was landed into this here you find, I think it's Schoinius beach. So yeah, you kind of have the camp in the far right in here, but still the Greeks might assault the ships during the night, so it's kind of it's not really the best option. It's a good option, but it still makes your fleet too vulnerable, and you need the fleet to escape Greece if things go wrong. So it's not really something you wanna risk so unnecessarily. So another place for the camp might have been also in here. In this place you find here Trikoritos here in the north, over the marsh, but there is the same problem, because there is the marsh in the swamp in the middle, and how do you reach the ship if something goes wrong, or if the ships are attacked, etc. So I believe that the best way to place the camp, for the Persians, would have been just here left of the Great Marsh, in where you find the trophy here. So it has advantages, because you can essentially you're relatively close to sources of fresh water. You can protect the fleet, most importantly, as well. I mean, obviously having fresh water is like your first need, but at this point also the fleet comes right after, and as a very important thing. So it's also pretty close to the seashore in the first place, so that there is not a lot of you can really back and forth in the ships if there is any need for that. So it's kind of fine. So just imagine having the camp here around Trophy and being pretty close to Shiniest Beach, where all the ships lay well preserved. There is some I mean, there are pros and cons to this position, because from one side, yeah, we have seen how the fleet is well protected, but at the same time there is not excessive space to actually move troops easily between the camp and the ships. There is a thin stripe of land, there is still this kind of marshy thing in the middle, so you can't really deploy reserves very quickly. And this can be a problem, and it might actually have led to the defeat of the Persians into the Battle of Marathon, even though we don't really know, it's just pure speculation, but that has to do on the, let's say, on the speed into which the Persians could deploy especially cavalry. That is the big mystery of this battle, because it kind of disappears at a certain point from Herodotus' story. But anyhow, I give it for that, and yeah. Also, by the way, there is a great plain right off the right out of the camp. You have to think the Greeks and the Greek phalanx at this point was not a very at least they thought, the Persians thought that the hoplitic phalanx of the Greeks of the Athenians couldn't really be speed up. So before it crossed the field, it would have taken, according to the Persians, too much time. So this was enough also to have the camp relatively exposed. Actually, the Greeks managed to reduce this disadvantage during the battle in a very risky way, but it would probably came to be determinant, or at least we can guess about it. So one of the interesting things is that the other times the Persians had landed in both in the Cyclades and especially against Eretria, they had immediately been very aggressive towards the local. So they had kind of, you know, this speaks up about the effectiveness of the Persian army. They were capable of handling amphibious operations, combined operations between cavalry and infantry, so they were pretty dynamic. They could besiege, so they were a perfect army. By the way, at this point, however, when they land into Attica, they don't really take a very aggressive direction. And this is kind of normal, though, because Athens was kind of, you know, a tougher nut to crack compared to what the other Hellenic cities during the campaign had been, and the resistance had been. It was a big city right? It was actually the largest one, and the it was difficult in the first place to even besiege it. We've seen the Persians weren't that many, and their commitment into the campaign didn't even render necessary a direct attack on Athens. All what the Persians were counting on was this internal settling of Athens that would have, according to them, hopefully resolved it by itself. So what they had done by landing at Marathon was basically landing pretty close to Athens. We have seen it roughly 40 kilometers, so being a looming threat over the city. But at the same time, this obliged the Athenians to kind of, if they wanted to meet the Persians, so to get rid of this threat, or at least trying, because the Athenians were also less than the Persians, they also were considered tactically inferior, considered at least, and they would have left. This would have obliged them to leave the city. So imagine the whole Athenian army at this time being 40 kilometers away from Athens, because the Athenians eventually would have baited at this. So and Athens remains basically unarmed, and especially with all the citizens that wanted to participate to the army that were naturally against the Persians and therefore against Hippias and his tyranny. Well, at that point it would have left the city exposed also to Hippias' partisans. So this is what the Persians were counting on at this point, to let things work out by themselves into Athens, and not even having to attack it directly. So the Athenians, so let's pass now from the Athenian perspective finally. So the Athenians knew perfectly that they were in serious trouble at this point, because the Persians had made already their show off. They had demonstrated they could raise any opposition. We have seen they had seen it in the north of Greece 2 years before, now in the Cyclades and up to Euboea, and their Athenian major companion in this anti-Persian enterprise, Eretria, had been wiped out essentially. So now the Athenians perfectly understood it was their turn. The other Greeks hadn't basically responded to Athens really, because they feared the Achaemenid army. So they, especially the cities that had fallen into the Persian hands at this point, had put up a sort of resistance, but eventually they had given up. Certain of the cities that had fallen into the Cyclades had actually been, including actually also Eretria, if I'm not wrong, in Euboea, had eventually opened the gates to the Persians. The internal pro-Persian party had in that case had proven to be functional for the Persians and to be effective. So the Athenians were quite worried, not just by the Persian army but also by an internal strife. But they had, they realized that the only way to make it through was to deal with the Persian army first, because eliminated that, there was nothing that much the Hippias party could do at that point. So at this point they called up their allies. They also asked to Sparta to participate. The Spartans at this time were famously, they responded that they couldn't intervene up to the new moon because they were during a local festival, and then Sparta couldn't take arms. And that would have equated essentially waiting for 10 days more. So time also here is a very important thing. The Athenians, however, do not mind about the Spartan response and decide to send troops immediately to Marathon. So it's a pretty sudden, a pretty immediate reaction. So this is interesting as well, because in spite of the fear that naturally there was against of the Persians, Athens kind of responded well to this. They kind of immediately knew what to do. That is a pretty important indicator also of the internal situation that is important to consider. So they arrive to the plain of Marathon. So here from the map you see they cross. Also there were marshes also in this here close to Marathon. They arrive to this sacred grove to Heracles, and they kind of encamp nearby, probably on these Agriliki hills. So it's kind of a good option because the camp is on the hill, so it can be defended. There is the stream in front of you, and the grove with the marshy area. So you kind of have a natural obstacle that can fence off the Persians and to allow you as kind of a swift retreat that in case things get wrong, or in case and this is very important, because think about cavalry out there in the open. So even in the case of the pitched battle that we're going for, this was kind of a huge natural fence but it still could have some kind of could offer some kind of defense against the cavalry. Basically the Athenians had accepted to play. I mean, they had baited at the Persians, but they were still kind of they could still disengage in practice. So there was a kind of stalemate at this point, because the two armies didn't from a strategical point of view they all knew what to do, but tactically speaking they didn't want to start the fight. They confronted and faced for days. And it seems that especially at this point the Athenians naturally were waiting for the Spartans, because 2,000 Spartans were being sent after those 10 days of waiting. So the Persians obviously were worried of the Spartan, that would have equated to a more enemies to fight against. So it's the kind of time was in favor of the Greeks for this reason. The Persians at this point, however, are still not. You're still to frame this in a broader strategical dimension, because the Persians didn't really need to accelerate the hostilities at this point. Even if the Spartans had arrived, because the Greeks weren't not even harassed nor provoked during these days. It's as if the Persians had kept to show the Greeks that everything was really fine. There was no need to fight, that the campaign could still finish with a peaceful solution, at least for the Athenians. So this is pretty important. By the way, it's still important also to it's also important to see that the harassment on the Athenian army would have been carried out preferably by cavalry, right? Since the Persians had it, chiefly light cavalry that was good at skirmishing and harassing, etc. From this point onwards, we know nothing more about the Persian cavalry from Herodotus. So we don't really know. It gets out of our radar. We can't but speculate about what the hell was Persian cavalry doing at this point. And I've read some of even the most fantasy-like explanations for this. You have to think at this time cavalry, as we were saying before, was used extensively for foraging. There is no explicit mention of this, but we are in September now, and at this time in Greece, there is the harvest of grapes, of olives. So the Persian army was, we have seen it. It wasn't a huge army. It was pretty consistent, so it needed to forage. So it's perfectly plausible that this cavalry, especially during certain times of the day, was not on the battlefield. It was somewhere else for this reason. But we don't really know. It's not engaged into this. The Persians at this point were not asking for a fight, and this has also to be understood because it would have been enough also to sensibly weaken the Athenian system. Even think about how much it costed to have an army of 9-10,000 troops fielded in for several days. I mean, even for a city like Athens, it was pretty well off by this time, and it was still a pretty consistent effort. So that meant essentially taking off resources from their own system. I mean, while the Persians were foraging from, devastating the surrounding countryside, and they also had these. Naturally, also Athenians had allies and aides, etc. But the Persians were like, the Athenians were playing at home, and we've already said how much the political situation could be reversed in the city, and all these military costs also probably had not just a strictly economical but also political cost and influence in this sense. So the Persians could easily ravage the countryside. It was not their home, it was not their land, so they could do it and still feed their army in some way. I'm sure they also had logistical problems. I mean, especially staying for very long on a certain in the same place with a camp, etc. It's very risky. You think about epidemics and stuff like that, but they kind of knew what they were doing. Okay, we can't trust the Persians and their military organization. So what the Persians wanted to do at this point was just wear the Athenians out, to weaken them. They didn't need to bet everything on one major clash. They just wanted to let the Athenians engage into this, while all the connection between Hippias and his partisans could work something out. And by the way, if the more this went on, the more the Athenians would have had less resources to invest for further operations. While the Persians had their fleet, where they could move where they wanted, the Athenians at this point were kind of, on the passive side from this point of view. So the Persians didn't need to wipe out their entire army into a bloody engagement. They just wanted to wait and they could re-embark and re-attack the Athenians somewhere else. So it's a kind of it's not that the Persians were scared at this point. We're probably still confident, in part, although probably this was already start to decline, because also the Athenian army was not small, as we've seen. There were less than the Persians, but they were still, probably also heavier in equipment than the average. Surely the Persians had more effective tactics. They had a more complete army than the hoplite, but that was still kind of a consistent force, and so the Persians were cautious as well. Everything had gone well up to that point. Let's try not to screw it up. So the Athenians, what were the Athenians thinking now? Because this is the point. They ran to Marathon. Okay, they've started facing the Persian army day after day. This is normal. In military history, if you wonder what armies do when they face each other, they basically draw up in battle formation, and they stay there for a while during the day, and then they come back to the camp. And it happens over and over again, every day. Okay, so this also sets up a kind of kind of habitude. It's not you can't trick the enemy by the sheer routine in this sense. You obviously, this was also a moment to which you could assess the enemy forces, what they were like, drawn up in battle formation. So it's a moment. It's an important moment of studying, of kind of also of psychological tension, of kind of think about the naturally. As we were saying before, Herodotus said that the Greeks were frightened at the only name of the Medes, and now the Persians were there. So just think, wow, a Persian army in there. It had never been seen. I mean, the Greeks knew the Persians; they had been in Asia, etc., as mercenaries. I mean, but now the Persian army, the dreaded Persian army, was in their own soil, and this is important because it's also pretty. I mean, from a psychological point of view, it's also like, it's not a place like another. Like, these guys have come on your own, in front of your own home. It's a serious thing. And naturally, this stimulates different reactions, and so what had the Athenians to do now? Because they were theoretically the ones they had to attack. They had the most immediate pressure. Like the Persians, yeah, they had arrived there. They kind of had their own business, their own empire. They were back. They had all the time in the world, in a way. The Athenians didn't, because the situation in the city at this point could be reversed from a moment to another. They had only their own city. So what if something went wrong? I mean, the Greeks were the Athenians were much more anxious in this sense, and they needed to attack. If you wonder who decides to attack or not, you have to look at the strategical factors. What is that pushes an army to decide to attack or not to attack? Most of warfare is about this, of continuous confrontation without getting to direct clash. And at a certain point, there are reasons, causes that trigger this clash. And the Athenians were the ones that were more wanting for attacking, and I always think that attack also implies that you have more pressure for doing it, and plus you lose more resources because the attack consumes more resources than defense. So you really have to be kind of pretty decided to do it if you do it, and the Athenians would do it. So it was evident that there was a stale at this point. So first of all, how was the Athenian army working? How was it composed? So we've said at this point the Athens was divided in tribes. This was the repartition of 10 tribal contingents, and they made up the phalanx. So they were split. They had basically one commander for each tribe. That was called the Strategos, and plus there was the Polemarchus, that was instead the this 11th commander was a bit in charge of the whole thing in many ways. This was very important because the Strategos is also, let's make a bit of etymology here. It's mostly has to do with a strictly military business. It's like the commander proper. It has to do with the soldiers in practice. The Polemarchus, instead, if you take the Greek etymology, it derives from polemos and arche. So polemos means war, and arche is the kind of the one. Arche sometimes is translated as empire. Like the Seleucid Empire, for instance, was called Arche Seleukeia or Seleukeia. I don't know what the accent lays. So he was the guy who directed the war. And he was not just a military commander, but he also had certain religious responsibility. Now, at this time, you have to think that religious affairs were extremely important in military. I have a video to suggest you that is not mine. Is one of from Lindibej. Lindibej made kind of this video about how important was all these rituals before battles, and how to find the most propitious moment, because theoretically it was all about listening to what the gods allowed men to do. This happened from both sides, and that is a nice video. Lindy Baj and I kind of say the same thing. Like maybe I think it's slightly in a different way from what he does, but the essentials are those. So I really warmly advise you to look at that video. I don't remember the title, but if you Google Lindy Baj religion, sacrifice, something like that, you should pop out. But anyhow, this is important because every, the outcome of battles was not about what men did, it was about what the gods had decided. So if you had not listened to the god, if the victims, sacrificial victims, didn't display this message from they didn't give green light, essentially you couldn't even attack. So there were lots of these, think of all these poor goats and pigs being slaughtered. My god, I don't know about pigs, goats, cows, stuff like that. Anyhow, and however, I advised you that Lindy Baj video because in that video he stresses, how was this really believed. I mean, if there was an extremely favorable option to attack, and the sacrifice, the gods of the animal told you that the deity was not okay with that, to attack, for instance, would you still not? I mean, he explained that there was probably some kind of adjustment at this point. We know at this point that even the Oracle of Delphi was bribed, so let's say, yeah, that... but this is not important now, also because we don't have any other kind of hint from the sources about this. The Polemarchus of the Athenian army was Callimachus, and he had actually a privileged role into the battle, which was leading himself the right wing of the Athenian army, the Athenian formation. Now, this thing of the Greek of the right flank is very important into Hellenic warfare, because basically the Hellenic formations at this point, being made of hoplites, they tended to all shift towards the right. It's not just about them, but in history, but it's something they tended to do because they tended to stick very much together to protect mostly, tendentially, their left flank, even if the shield was put in the front to form the defense, but still you were still using it with your left arm. So what happened is that instinctively all the formation while marching tended to go towards the right. I can't stress enough how these guys were non-professionals of war. These were amateurs. The Hellenic classical hoplite is not a warrior at all. Only the Spartans were, which are the only exception that confirms the rule. All the other Greeks were not. They were citizens lent to war, essentially, and this problem of the shifting towards the right flank was a big deal of a problem because these guys had a relatively few collective training, being non-professionals. So it was difficult in the first place to make the phalanx advancing without disrupting. Secondly, it was this kind of push towards the right. So kind of the best units were set on the right, even the officers that had to, the most, they had to even physically kind of counter push the push towards the right. Hellenic warfare at this point was made up of brute force. It was not made of collective sophisticated tactics. People think that in order to be a good soldier you have to be brutally strong. No, if you look at history, that's exactly the contrary. Greek hoplites at this time had to be strong physically because their equipment was very heavy, but they were very poorly trained. So that was very disruptive for the formation. Now, what the Greeks achieved in Marathon was amazing under this point of view. We will see that in synthesis. As I said before, we're not talking about the battle proper, but just the strategical thing. So commanding the right wing meant to be essentially leading the best part of the army. There was on average the best trained among the average, let's say, it was still pretty low. So that this was the one that made was the unit that had to make the whole army marching straight, advancing ahead linearly. It was an important role, but what the Greeks managed to do is amazing during the battle itself, because they managed to, this push towards the right kind of allowed kind of unwanted actual wheel towards the right. What the Greeks managed to do instead, exactly in the right wing respectively, because that was naturally feasible instinctively on the left wing, was to wheel left on the right wing, and this is how the Persians were caught by a pincer movement by the Greek wings. But anyhow, I will make a video about Marathon one day. But it's still important to understand. Obviously, it was not an immensely ordered maneuver at all. It's not that the Greeks became trained from a day to another in a marathon. It's just that they were determined, and they kind of made it work, even if they didn't know how to. One problem of sometimes you have to read, if you want to understand military history, you have to look at politics and society, always, because this is the Clausewitzian triad. If you want to understand how an army worked, you have to look at the politics and the society. So, naturally, the Hellenic armies at this time were, they had some advantages, they had some disadvantages. One of these advantages was the lack of a unity of command, because these democratic armies all basically brought the political debate onto the field, because every strategos, as we've seen, was at the head of the respective tribe of Athens, and basically there was a rotation. Like the army was commanded every day by different strategos together with the polemarchus, and they rotated. So actually what you see that Herodotus tells us is that the Athenian council of the strategoi was divided. Of the 5 strategoi, 5 of the 10 strategoi, 5 were pro-attack, and the other 5 were against. And Miltiades was the strategos that basically pushed the most for the attack, was put by the other 4 strategoi that were in favor of the attack at the lead of all of them. They kind of gave him even the chance to be commander in their place at that point. So at this point the polemarchus had to decide, and this was interesting, because the polemarchus, in this sense, if there was a draw, like in this case, could take sides and shift in the balance. So Callimachus actually decides to support Miltiades, so the pro-attack faction, let's say. So Miltiades in this way was delegated by the other strategoi to at the lead of the army, and however, the strange thing about that Herodotus says is that still, now I don't really remember whether if the rotation was still in place, however, also with the other 5 strategoi that were against the attack. But Miltiades, this is what Herodotus says, is that Miltiades actually wanted to wait, not just for, that day over 2 that he was given the chance to command the army by his other 4 supportive strategoi, but actually he wanted to wait for his own day to attack. And this means that if the Persians had attacked, in the meanwhile, he would have not been at the lead of the army by the day that. However, this is a bit speculative as well, because what we know very few. We know really this much about how the thing went. So everything is speculation, as I'm saying since the beginning. Now, another thing is that seemingly the two armies, so the Hellenic and the Persian armies, were in contact with each other. This is kind of also normal during battles, especially if there are these kind of big armies. There is always someone who kind of crosses, either people who flee, or sometimes there are even direct negotiations, etc. So there is another tradition, the say, that tells that the Ionians in the Persian army, so the Greeks that were essentially had been brought into from Ionia into Attica forcibly in part by the Achaemenids, kind of betrayed the Achaemenids and revealed at the to the Athenians the day to which the Achaemenid cavalry would have not be on the field. This is also a speculation, and this is actually, there will be a lot to tell about this, because both these two traditions are kind of theoretical in many ways. They sound pretty much anecdotal in many ways. What I think is that first of all, during the Battle of Marathon, this is the premise, there is no evidence of Persian cavalry involved into the combat. So no evidence doesn't mean that there wasn't in the first place, but for some reason there is an extensive lack of evidence. There is just one depiction of of all the sources that exist, also of later times of the battle, just a depiction. I don't remember whether it's a vase or a painting, however, that shows, for the Battle of Marathon, a Persian cavalryman. That's all we have. For the rest, we know nothing, and we are prone to think that the Persian cavalry at that, on the day of the battle, was, if not there, at least it was not deployed for some reason that we will try to think about now. So, Marathon was. The Battle of Marathon was fought on September the 11th, 490 BC. Also here, relatively to the cavalry, another option is that there was surely there was some cavalrymen in the Battle of Marathon from the Persian side. As much as we know, there surely was also some Hellenic cavalrymen from the Athenian side, for sure. You don't have to think of everyone strictly not, and there were horses around, etc. So we just suspect that the full Persian mounted force wasn't there, or wasn't ready for some reason. Herodotus is kind of I don't know how to say this. It doesn't seem to tell it all. Really, it's as if he's skipping on some detail that we would crave for knowing. Really, you have to think that, especially after many days of confrontation, the two armies, you kind of get used also to the enemy in their routine, as we were saying before. So you start understanding at which hour they start deploying, what's their timing, how they organize, etc. So it might be possible, especially if the cavalry was foraging somewhere, that during the day that the Greeks actually knew when to attack, when the cavalry would have not been there. There are other people who say, there is also this big point here, is that it is believed that the Achaemenids were about to retreat from Marathon, or better. I don't really buy that. I think more than else that they had a kind of they had organized their own army in a way that it could be very quickly embarked in case of emergency, which is what would have practically happened. So this entailed the whole force in some measure, cavalry included. So my suggestion is, that is not just mine, obviously there are plenty of historians who tell this, is that the cavalry actually was normally, might even be sleeping at night into the ships themselves. So that the ships were used as stables. After all, we have seen that some of these triremes had been explicitly adapted, expressly adapted for making horses fitting in there. So these kind of stable ships were ship stables, or you want to call them, were kind of also already suited for hosting cavalry and also having it protected. But at the same time, given also the nature of the terrain that we have seen before, you see that we were talking about before, that if the ships were here on Schwerpunkt beach and the camp was around Trophy here, which is pure speculation, but it's still possible, you know, it takes some time before if the horses sleep at night into the ships to get to the camp and to the formation, let's say. So what we know actually is the Athenians on the day of the battle anticipated the time of deployment, or at least they marched into battle in a much quicker rate, in a much quicker fashion that they were used to deploy in the previous days. So the real option here is that, in my opinion, I estimate very much the Achaemenid army. So for me, it's perfectly possible that the Persian army could be so well organized they could embark and very quickly. And I like very much the horses were sleeping at night into the ships. They were also pretty well protected, as we will see. So the cavalry here was a kind of an elite force of, I can't say elite force, but it kind of was we have seen what the strategical weight of it was, because this cavalry allowed the army to be extremely much more dynamic into the strategic theater, and it was so important to secure the landing perimeters before, so it was a very vital thing to operate in Greece, and especially landing with the army through the ships and adding to this strategical speed and deployability, let's say, of the troops. So what did happen is, we don't know, but I suggest, just as a speculation, as many others do, so I obviously don't, it's not my thing, that the Athenians anticipated the deployment of the Persian cavalry in the morning. Now, in order to deploy an army, you have to figure it takes time. It's not that, you know, like in video games, that troops arrive there, remain in formation, everything it happens. No, it takes time to order it, to form the ranks, to actually put every man in the place it has to be, because soldiers are not equal. They're not all equal. There is a very important order you have to follow within the same formation. Men are used kind of relying on the guy who is in the front. They kind of know to trust. It doesn't work that you can change direction or get into the fight without order or without. That's complete fantasy. No army ever fought like that, if not to annihilation. So we can expect the Achaemenids didn't do that. So it's very possible that, in this sense, the Athenians engaged the Persian army before at least the full mounted force of the Persians was deployed. So why by the way, did the Persians didn't think about that? Well, they didn't think about that because, as I was saying before, they didn't think that the Hellenic phalanx could actually reach their formation quickly. They knew that Greek hoplites were slow, that their formation could break if they had increased the speed of the march. So they were kind of saying, okay, fine, they will attack. We will have plenty of time, because if they speed up and they try to cover this open ground without order, they're kind of lost. They can't keep the formation. After all, they're just amateurs of war, right? It's not like us Persians who have an extremely sophisticated army combined with combined army, combined tactics, and all discipline, training, etc. That's how, by the way, you underestimate an enemy. That's how it happened, in my opinion. And actually, the Greeks were, let's tell it all, they were also pretty lucky in many ways. They were good, they were great actually, but that doesn't, many times that's not enough, really. So I just don't want to say it's simply that what happened at Marathon during that battle kind of remains in the annals of history because of, indeed, something that neither the Greeks could really believe in after they had done it. Like, there was all a myth revolving around for generations around the Battle of Marathon. When the youngers asked the veterans to tell them about that day, these veterans seemingly answered, "We were pursuing." To really express it all synthetically how that battle had went, when eventually the Persian army broke, and the Greeks launched themselves, by the way, suffering many losses in return, by the way, because they abandoned their formation by pursuing the Persians, and therefore breaking the phalanx and eventually engaging these guys in front of the ships that were trying to embark, and in sometimes individual fight, into which the Persians were considerably better than the Hellenic hoplite. So eventually the Persians lost something like, the accounts say something like 6,400, and the Greeks 192. But that's also pretty a trick, because if you divide 600, that number between the sum of the Persian losses and the Greek ones, the result is like 33.333333, etc. So you realize that that's kind of a it's just a way of saying, for a single Greek died many Persians, but it's not the real number. Probably the Persian losses were not extremely high as we might think of them, but surely, probably, especially considering that the number of ships the Athenians were able to take of the Persians, so at least 1,600 Persians remained probably dead, or at least captured in there, because they couldn't escape, because the ships were still there. So, but also in here it's a bit speculation. So, so as I was saying, as I've been unfortunately saying all the time of the video now, we won't talk about the battle. We just say in a nutshell that basically the Greeks do this amazing thing, that is to run. To run only. They kind of speed up at the enemy. The last 100 meters probably they even ran in some fashion. So, and inexplicably they managed to keep their formation, at least enough to actually join into the battle. This is astonishing, because Herodotus actually, for the reasons we have said, these hoplitic phalanxes couldn't really, they could break extremely easily by running. So, but you have to think about the impetus of the Athenians at this point, of all the moral resources they had, the courage. In fact, what Herodotus says, you might say it's a pity because it doesn't really give a technical explanation, but I think it's still extremely worth understanding it, because it's the most important thing. He doesn't stress much this fact that the phalanx had remained compact, because that was not the big thing. The big thing is that the courage that the Athenians had, that up to that day they had been scared at the only name of the Persian, and instead they charged into their army and they crushed it. The Athenian center was thinner, because they had decided to extend battle line to not to be outflanked by the Persians, so to covering the whole Persian line. The Persians were more, so the Greeks had necessarily had to thin up the formation. The center was chiefly only 4 lines deep, so it's very few. Normally the phalanx was 2 times more. Was in fact on the flanks it was 8 hoplites deep. But in fact, during the clash that followed, the Athenian center was about to break, but instead the wings managed to overwhelm the Persians on the flanks, or also the other Greeks, because by the way we said there were several Greek hoplites also in the Persian army. Herodotus tells us that there was an hoplite. He states that during the combat there's this story. There's a huge birdie hoplite that was fighting alongside with the Persians. We know that were the Scythians as well, so it was pretty multi-ethnic army like all the Achaemenid armies. Basically what is extraordinary here is when the Persian wings collapses, the 2 Hellenic wings are incredibly capable of orderly enclosing the Persian center into a grip, into a pincer movement. This is extraordinary because the Greeks weren't up to that point had never been capable of doing anything like that, because their armies were simply not conceived to do that, and still they managed to do it. So they had the necessary strength, the necessary cold blood, even if after having run for kilometers at that point, having run and having fought also, because that is the actual problem. Think about it. Was exhausting. This was exhausting, and with an hoplite panoply on, it's something extremely heavy. It's not like the Persians were kind of relatively lightly armored. Not all of them though, because the sources tell us that at least, we know that a consistent part of the Persians was also armored as well, and they stuck to that also during the Second Punic, once again, Second Persian War. And yeah, what Herodotus says, the courage of these guys, that kind of, even when the whole Persian army collapsed and all the Persians began to run toward the ships, the hoplites kind of, at that point they lost the kind of the intelligence, because they were so overwhelmed by the excitement of having crushed the Persians in battle. So do you really understand what it means to have crushed the Persians in battle? The greatest army on earth, the greatest empire on earth, being defeated. So this is really the greatest outcome of the first Persian invasion of Greece. Is it's the confidence that the Greeks had. That is extremely important. If they had been defeated at Marathon, probably there would have not been even a second Punic, once again, a second Persian war, because Greece would have not risen anymore against the Persians. On that day in Marathon, the Greeks showed that the Persians could be defeated. That is very, very important in military history. Marathon is probably even more than the Thermopylae or the or Plataea or Salamis. It's really Marathon. According to me, it's really the morally speaking the most influential one. Well, what happened there was extraordinary in many ways. So yeah, basically we have said more in a nutshell what the Greeks made, and it's seemingly the cavalry, the Achaemenid cavalry somehow didn't play an important role in all this. So it's or if it did, by the way, because this is also a point, is that it's possible that the Greeks maybe at a certain point the cavalry showed up, and the Greeks in fact retreated to the camp at a certain point. So it's still possible, maybe it's untold, but it's still a realistic chance, especially if the cavalry was out for for foraging, and so it wasn't really deployed. But as I was saying before, these are just speculations properly. So going back at so we have seen this kind of picture of Marathon, and we go back to the map of Attica now, because it's okay. I'm just signing where I have to insert the picture for the montage, let's say. And so this was an important battle, as we were saying. It was really important for the Greeks, but it really didn't have a big strategical outcome, to be honest. Miltiades' line had won. The Athenians at this point were really over the top. They felt like in heaven, because it was such a great glory to have accomplished what they had done. But what they did, however, it's not that they were there sleeping and getting drunk or etc. What they did, and so they remained kind of lucid in this. The Athenian army, as soon as the Persians embarked and sailed off, by the way, they ran immediately back to Athens. This was important because the fleet at that point could reach Athens before they had come back, so that didn't have to happen. So the phalanx in this was as well amazing, and they with the arrival in Athens, basically the Athenian army obliged the Persian force to give up any further move during the campaign and coming back to Asia. Because at this point, coming back to Athens, the Athenian army had extinguished any hope for Hippias' partisans to carry out a revolt. So the Persians still hoped that, even if they had been defeated at Marathon, we don't know in fact the entity of the losses, but they could have still taken Athens in a way or in another, and there was not much else that could be done. So there is, however, a bit of a another interesting point is that Herodotus says that before passing Cape Sunion, so getting around Attica from Marathon and approaching Athens at Phaleron, so we're basically at the outskirts of Athens. It's a port in the Bay of Phaleron. The Persians wasted time charging the slaves that they had left in Aegina. So the point is, if the Persians were so concerned about making it quick, why is they wasted time? Really, to do that. So really, this might have not occurred as well. So even if I think that if this is how things went, and the Persians wanted really to take Athens, even after Marathon, they surely sailed away, hoping to make it before the Athenian phalanx to Athens before, and to make it the city rise, and not wasting time reloading all the slaves they had taken in Eretria and the other Greek cities for no reason, wasting time and making any chance collapsing. So maybe Herodotus is wrong. But anyhow, we're equally thankful to him for having written this. So, so they, in fact, when the Achaemenid fleet arrived at Phaleron, they found the same Athenian phalanx deployed in there. So there was no way to land, and the Persians made it back to Mykonos, and they kind of sailed away to Asia, and So this is kind of the moral of the story in many ways. There is no really there is not really much more to say about this, if not that indeed from a strategical point of view, the first Persian invasion of Greece was not a complete failure. We've seen it, but it really created the premises for the Greeks to really believe in themselves, to think they could really beat the Persians. That was extremely important for morale. So the seeds eventually for the Hellenic resistance in the Second Persian War, I managed not to say Punic War this time, were there now, and everything had changed. You can argue that a lot in human history had changed at that point, and all thanks to what happened to Marathon. But at the same time, this video wanted also to be a kind of a appreciative video towards the military capabilities of the Persians, especially from an organizational point of view in here, and not to make you underestimate the Achaemenid armed forces, because they were the most advanced at the times. And Marathon was a great battle that showed how the Hoplite phalanx could still work, but in a quite unusual way, and how actually we have to bear in mind that the Achaemenid armed forces were actually much more sophisticated than the Hellenic ones at this time. It's just with Hellenistic warfare and Philip II and Alexander, then the say the Hellenic world, or however, from a linguistical point of view, kind of made it to surpass and to add something more to the art of war, to the art of war that had existed either up to that point. So this is important to understand because it's very didactic also in here. It shows that you don't have, in order to win a war, you don't really have to have the best army or the it takes intelligence, it takes luck, takes courage as well, but mostly intelligence. And really that's what the Greeks displayed. They tried it, and war is like that. If you study von Clausewitz, you realize that there is no certainty for victory, so you have to take risks anyway. And this is really the toughest, probably some of the toughest part of war in itself, because yeah, we naturally always emotionally stress the sufferings, etc. But think of what it means in the higher echelons, really to take decisions like attacking the Persians, like the Athenians did at Marathon in that fashion. I mean, it's something you have really to bet on. You're not sure of winning, but however, this was the way they made it. So this is also what remained to military history and what for us to think about, and this is very, very important. So this video was very long, as I see, probably the longest I've ever made, but I think that this the campaign of Marathon really deserved, because it's really one of the most important chapters in military history, as we've seen, not for excessive complexity at all. It's very simple, but thanks to this you can understand much also very essential things that you have to remember also if you want to learn about the rest of military history. And if you want to make a serious strategical analysis, you have to really take into consideration lots of things. Today we kind of attempted a synthesis of what thankfully historiography has overly written on, so I'm just a speaker. I'm not a strategical analyst myself, if not a very extremely modest way, believe me. But if you want really, if you want to study a campaign, it takes an awful lot of time. Actually, I wrote a master thesis studying a campaign at the end of the 13th century. It took me 1 year. I'm not kidding. It took me 1 year, and because you really have to check everything. and I studied the battle, of course, the battles that were taking place in the campaign as well. But I mean, yeah, we are in the end of the 13th century. We're not talking about something so complex like, I don't know, a World War II campaign. So that not even one life is enough to study things like Operation Overlord or I mean, there is extensive amount, and just for a battle of the 13th century, 1 year of studying. So that's the reason why I can't condensate seriously a strategical analysis in 2 hours and 40, even for a essentially mono-source story, or at least, yeah, there are several sources, also lots of other things, but yeah, it's also relatively simple to tell. So be please extremely scrupulous. Never buy things that are explained in a few words. I realized that out there, especially on YouTube, there are much more entertaining videos than mine, especially those who have a lot of graphics attached and cool effects and look shiny and nice and funny, etc. But I really care about the contents of making people think, not just to to show them something funny, and I care very much about this. So I hope that you will, I don't know, that through this video you maybe understood how important it is to spend more than the usual thinking about these things, because it takes time and it takes to reflect, it takes to, and I kind of also made it simple now, because there are lots of other things I would like to add, but now I'll cut it short because it's excessively long. So I'm glad I spoke about this. I will definitely make a video of all the battles of the Persian wars and about Marathon, about all the others, and we will have the chance to look at everything in detail. But for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.